The car skidded to a stop on gravel, and Elena Marsh nearly hit her head on the dashboard. Outside the window stood a gate, taller than any building she had seen in her life, made of black iron twisted into shapes that looked almost alive. Guards on either side did not move. They did not blink. They watched her the way a wolf watches something it has not decided to trust yet. "This is it," said the driver, a quiet man named Callum, who had not spoken more than 10 words since picking her up from the airstrip 3 hours earlier. "Blackthorn Court. Get out now. They do not like waiting." Elena's hands were shaking as she gathered her single bag from the seat beside her. She had been told, back in the city, that this transfer was routine, a researcher exchange, a formality. Nobody had mentioned iron gates or silent guards or the strange, heavy feeling in the air, like the whole forest around the estate was holding its breath. The gates opened without a sound. Inside, the courtyard was full of people, though none of them spoke above a whisper. Servants moved quickly, eyes down. A woman in a deep green coat rushed toward Elena, her expression somewhere between panic and relief. "You must be Elena," the woman said. "I am Leora. Please, come with me, quickly. He does not like to be kept waiting, and today of all days, you do not want to test that." "Who?" Elena asked, but Leora was already walking, her heels clicking fast against the stone path. They crossed the courtyard, climbed a wide staircase, and passed through 2 enormous doors that seemed to swing open on their own. Inside, the hall stretched so far that the far end disappeared into shadow. Candlelight flickered along the walls even though it was the middle of the afternoon, and at the end of the hall, seated on a chair that was not quite a throne but close enough, was a man Elena would spend the rest of her life trying to describe, and never quite managing. He did not look up right away. He was reading something, a paper held loosely in one hand, and the stillness around him was so complete that Elena felt she had walked into a photograph rather than a room. When he finally lifted his eyes to her, she felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her feet. "This is the new transfer," Leora said, her voice smaller than it had been a moment ago. "Elena Marsh, from the research division." The man studied her for a long moment. His eyes were a strange pale gold, like something out of an old story, and there was nothing warm in them. Not cruelty exactly, just distance. The kind of distance that came from being looked at, and never truly seen, for a very long time. "Elena," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that did not need to be raised to fill a room. "Yes," she said, and then, because the silence stretched a beat too long, and she felt she should say something else, she added, "And you are Alpha Kalen?" The room did not move. Nobody breathed. Leora's hand found the edge of a nearby table, and gripped it, as if she needed something solid to hold on to. Somewhere behind Elena, a servant carrying a tray of drinks stopped completely still, as though freezing might undo what had just been said. Elena had no idea what she had done wrong. The man on the chair tilted his head very slightly, the way a large animal does when it hears an unfamiliar sound, and is deciding whether it is a threat. For 3 full seconds, nobody in the hall dared to correct her. Not Leora, not the servant with the tray, not the 2 guards stationed near the doors, both of whom had gone rigid, watching their king the way people watch a pot they fear is about to boil over. Elena felt the tension without understanding its shape. She only knew that something had shifted, that the air itself seemed thinner, and that every person in the hall was waiting for something terrible to happen. It did not happen. The man's mouth curved, just barely, at one corner. Not quite a smile. More like the shadow of one, there and gone so fast Elena might have imagined it. "Welcome to Blackthorn," he said. "You will be shown to your rooms." That was all. He returned his attention to the paper in his hand, and the moment, whatever it had been, passed. Leora exhaled so hard it was almost a gasp, took Elena firmly by the arm, and steered her back out of the hall before another word could be spoken. Once the doors closed behind them, Leora did not let go of her arm until they had walked the length of 2 hallways and turned 3 corners. "What just happened?" Elena asked. "Did I do something wrong?" "No," Leora said, too quickly. "No, nothing. Nothing at all. Come. Your room is this way." But her voice shook slightly on the word nothing, and Elena, who had spent years learning to read the small cracks in people's composure, understood that nothing had been very far from the truth. Her room, when they reached it, was larger than any apartment she had ever lived in. Tall windows looked out over gardens that seemed to stretch endlessly into a line of dark trees. A fire had already been lit in the hearth, though the day was not cold. Someone had known she was coming, and had prepared for her, down to the small details, and yet nobody had told her the most important thing, what she was actually walking into. "I need you to be careful here," Leora said, finally releasing her arm and turning to face her fully. There was something urgent in her expression, something Elena had not seen from anyone else since arriving. "This place, it is not like where you came from. There are rules. Some of them are written down, most of them are not. Rules about what? About how you speak, who you speak to. And especially," Leora hesitated, glancing toward the door, as though someone might be listening even here, "especially about names." Elena frowned. "I only asked his name. Was that rude somehow?" Leora opened her mouth, closed it again, and then shook her head slowly. "Get some rest. Someone will come for you before dinner." She left before Elena could ask anything else, and the door clicked shut with a finality that made the silence of the room feel suddenly enormous. Elena sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, turning the moment over in her mind. She thought about the man's face when she had said the name, the way the whole room had gone still, as if bracing for impact. Whatever she had said, it had mattered. It had mattered a great deal, and nobody, not one single person in that hall, had been willing to tell her why. She told herself it was nothing. A cultural difference, perhaps, a formality she had not been briefed on. She was, after all, only here for research, and research assignments came with strange local customs all the time. She had worked in places where certain words could not be spoken indoors, where certain colors were forbidden at certain times of year. This was probably no different. A quirk, a local eccentricity, nothing more. But that explanation did not sit right, no matter how many times she tried it on. There had been fear in that room. Real fear. Sharp and immediate. The kind that came from people who understood exactly what was at stake, and knew they were powerless to stop it. And at the center of it all had been a man who, instead of correcting her, instead of doing whatever it was everyone seemed to expect him to do, had simply let it go. That, more than anything, was the part that stayed with her, as the light outside the tall windows began to fade into evening. Not the fear in the room, not the strange formality of the place, but the flicker at the corner of his mouth, gone so quickly she almost doubted she had seen it at all, as though some part of him had found the moment, against every expectation, almost pleasant. Dinner that evening was a quiet, careful affair. Elena was seated near the middle of a long table, flanked by two members of the household staff, who spoke to her in polite, clipped sentences, and steered every conversation away from anything personal. She learned little about the estate, less about the man she had met that afternoon, and nothing at all about why an entire room of grown adults had frozen at the sound of a name. He was not present at dinner. She noticed his empty chair at the head of the table, and wondered, briefly, if her arrival had somehow driven him away from his own meal, before deciding that was a foolish and self-centered thought and pushing it aside. It was Doran, the man introduced to her only in passing as the king's second, who finally slid into the seat across from her as dessert was being cleared. "You made quite an impression today," he said, in a tone that was hard to read, somewhere between amusement and warning. "I really did not mean to," Elena said. "I still do not understand what happened." Doran studied her for a moment, the way Leora had, as though deciding how much truth she could handle. "There are things here that matter more than you would guess, looking from the outside. Names. Titles, the order of things. It has been that way for a very long time, longer than anyone currently living has been alive to remember why." "That is not really an explanation," Elena said. "No," Doran agreed, standing. "It is not. But it is all I am prepared to give tonight." He inclined his head toward her, a small, formal gesture. "Sleep well, Elena Marsh. Tomorrow will likely be easier." It was not. Elena woke before dawn to the sound of birds she did not recognize, and for a moment she forgot entirely where she was. Then the weight of the previous day settled over her again, and she lay still, staring at the high ceiling, replaying the scene in the hall until she had memorized every detail of it, the stillness of the room, the gold of his eyes, the fraction of a smile that had appeared and vanished so fast she still was not certain it had been real. She dressed and made her way down to the gardens, hoping the fresh air might clear her head before whatever the day had planned for her. The gardens were even larger than they had looked from her window, hedges cut into shapes too precise to be anything but deliberate, paths curving between them like a puzzle, designed to be walked rather than solved. She was halfway along one of the paths when she saw him. He was alone, standing near a low stone wall at the garden's edge, looking out at the tree line beyond. He wore no crown, no formal coat, nothing that marked him as anything other than a tall man taking in a quiet morning. For a moment, Elena considered turning back before he noticed her, but it was too late. He had already seen her. "You are up early," he said, without turning fully to face her. "I could not sleep," Elena admitted, walking closer despite every instinct that told her to keep her distance. "Too much to think about, I suppose." "Yesterday," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." She hesitated, then decided that honesty was probably her safest option in a place this strange. "I still do not understand what I did wrong. Everyone went so quiet. Leora would not tell me anything. Doran gave me half an answer at best." He turned to look at her fully then, and in the pale morning light his eyes seemed less golden and more simply tired, the eyes of a man who had been looking out at the same tree line for a very long time, and had grown used to seeing nothing new in it. "You did nothing wrong," he said. "Then why did everyone react like that?" He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Elena began to think he would not answer at all. Then he said, "Because they expected me to correct you, and I did not." "Correct me about what?" Another pause, and then, almost gently, as though testing how the words felt in his own mouth, he said, "My name is not Kaelin." Elena's stomach dropped. "I am so sorry. I misheard, I think, when Leora introduced you, and no one said anything, so I assumed." "I know," he said. "That is why no one said anything. They were waiting to see what I would do." "And what will you do?" Elena asked, bracing herself despite not fully understanding what she was bracing against. He looked at her for a long moment, and this time the almost smile she had seen the day before returned, small and unreadable, but undeniably there. "Nothing," he said. "For now, nothing at all." He turned and walked back toward the house without another word, leaving Elena standing alone at the edge of the garden, more confused than she had been the night before, and, though she would not admit it to herself for several more days, more curious than she had been about anything in a very long time. Word of the garden conversation never reached the rest of the household, though Elena could not have said why she kept it to herself. Perhaps it was because she did not fully understand what had happened. Perhaps it was because some part of her sensed that whatever this was, it belonged only to the two of them, and speaking it aloud would break it the way breath breaks the surface of still water. She saw him twice more that first week, both times by chance, both times in places where the household staff were thin and the silence of the estate pressed close. The first was in the library, where she had gone looking for anything written in a language she could read, only to find him seated in a high-backed chair near the window, a book open on his knee, seemingly unaware of anyone else in the room. "Alpha Kaelin," she said, testing the name aloud, watching for his reaction. He did not look up from the page. "Yes?" That was all. No correction. No flicker of discomfort. Just a quiet acceptance, as though the wrong name suited him better in that moment than the true one ever had. Elena did not push further. She asked her question about the library's organization, received a brief, useful answer, and left, before the strangeness of the exchange could catch up with her. The second time was in a corridor near the eastern wing, late in the evening, when she had lost her way trying to find the dining hall and instead found him standing at a window, watching the last light fade over the tree line. He gave her directions without being asked, his voice low in the emptiness of the hall, and for a moment, just a moment, it felt almost like an ordinary conversation between two ordinary people, rather than whatever strange, careful thing was actually happening between them. It was Leora who finally broke the silence surrounding the matter, cornering Elena in a quiet sitting room 3 days into her stay, her expression tight with something between worry and disbelief. "He has not corrected you," Leora said, without preamble. "Not once. Not to your face, not to the staff, not to anyone. Do you understand what that means?" "Not really," Elena admitted. It means he is choosing to let it stand, Leora said, which he has never done. Not with anyone. Not in all the years I have known him. Is that bad? Leora sat down slowly across from her, choosing her words with obvious care. It is not bad. It is simply unprecedented. And when something is unprecedented here, people notice. People talk. And talk, in a place like this, is rarely harmless. Elena felt a small, uneasy weight settle in her chest. What are people saying? That you are either the bravest person to walk through those gates in a decade, Leora said, or the most oblivious. Personally, I am still deciding which. Elena laughed despite herself, and Leora's expression softened, just slightly, the tension in her shoulders easing for the first time since Elena had arrived. For what it is worth, Leora added, quieter now, I do not think it is a bad thing. I have known him a long time. I have never seen him let something go so easily. It makes me curious what it is about you that made the difference. Elena did not have an answer for that. She was still trying to understand it herself. That night, unable to sleep, she found herself back in the garden, drawn there by nothing she could name. She was not entirely surprised to find him there too, standing in nearly the same spot as before, as though the space had been waiting for both of them all along. You come here often, she said, walking closer. It is quiet, he said. There is very little quiet in my life. This is one of the few places I can find it. Even with me here? He glanced at her, and something in his expression shifted, softened, just enough that she noticed. Especially with you here, he said. Strange as that sounds. Why is that strange? Because everyone else who stands in this garden with me is careful, he said. They measure every word. They watch me for signs of what I want before they speak, and they shape themselves around it. You have not done that. Not once. You argue about the food. You forget to lower your eyes when you should. You called me by a name that is not mine, and have not once apologized for it as though it were a crime. Should I apologize? No, he said, and there was something almost urgent in the word, as though the thought of her apologizing troubled him more than the mistake itself ever had. Do not. I find I do not want you to. Elena studied him in the low light, trying to reconcile the man in front of her, quietly earnest, oddly vulnerable, with the composed, distant figure who had sat at the head of the hall on her first day. Why does it matter so much? It is only a name. It is not only a name, he said. Not here. My name carries weight. It carries history, obligation, expectation. Every time someone speaks it, they are speaking to all of that, not to me. When you say the wrong one, for a moment, you are speaking only to me. I did not realize how much I wanted that until it happened. The honesty in his voice caught Elena off guard. She had expected evasiveness, careful non-answers, the kind of guarded language she had grown used to from everyone else in the estate. Instead, he had simply told her the truth, plainly, without performance. That is a lot of pressure to put on one mistaken introduction, she said softly. Perhaps, he allowed. But I am not in the habit of examining things I do not care about closely enough to feel pressure over them. They stood together in silence after that, the garden dark and still around them, and Elena felt, for the first time since arriving at Blackthorn, that the ground beneath her feet was not quite as uncertain as it had seemed. Something had shifted between them in that conversation, small but undeniable, a thread pulled taut that had not existed the day before. Neither of them spoke of it again that night. But when Elena finally returned to her room and lay down to sleep, she found herself smiling at the ceiling, for reasons she did not fully examine, and somewhere across the estate, in a study, lit by a single lamp, the Alpha King sat with a report he was not reading, thinking about a name that was not his own, and finding, to his own quiet surprise, that he did not mind it at all. His name was Alaric Draven, and he had worn the title of Alpha King for 11 years, since the night his father had died, and left the entire weight of Blackthorn Court resting on shoulders that had, at the time, barely finished growing into a man's frame. 11 years of council meetings, treaty negotiations, disputes between pacts that stretched back generations, and not once, not a single time in all of it, had anyone in his presence forgotten who he was for even a moment. Until Elena Marsh had walked through his gates and called him by the wrong name. He thought about it more than he was willing to admit, turning the memory over during council sessions when he should have been listening to Councilman Ewan Thackeray drone on about grain tariffs, replaying it during long, sleepless nights when the estate was silent except for the wind moving through the trees outside his window. It was such a small thing, a mishearing, an accident of introduction, and yet it had lodged itself somewhere deep in him, refusing to let go. He understood, in the part of his mind that still functioned with cold, practical clarity, even when the rest of him was distracted, exactly why it mattered so much. His name was not simply a word, it was a weight his father had carried before him, and his father's father before that, stretching back through a line of alphas who had built and defended Blackthorn against every threat that had ever come for it. When people said his name, they were not speaking to him. They were speaking to the throne, to the history, to the expectation that came pressed into every syllable like a brand. Elena did not know any of that, and because she did not know it, when she spoke to him, she spoke only to the man standing in front of her. Nothing more, nothing less. It was, he realized with something close to astonishment, the first time in 11 years that anyone had done so. He watched her more than he should have that first week, though he told himself it was simple vigilance, the natural caution any alpha would exercise toward a new presence within his walls. He watched her argue with the kitchen staff about the spice in her food, watched her wander the halls without the careful, measured steps everyone else had learned to adopt in his presence, watched her forget, again and again, the small rituals of deference that had become so automatic to everyone else that they no longer even noticed themselves performing them. It should have irritated him. By every rule of the court, it should have demanded correction. Instead, he found himself looking forward to the moments their paths crossed, small and unplanned as they were, with an eagerness he had not felt about anything, in longer than he cared to examine. Doran noticed, of course. Doran noticed everything, which was precisely why he had remained the king's second for as long as he had. "You are smiling," Doran observed one afternoon, catching Alaric in a rare unguarded moment near the training yard, watching Elena cross the courtyard below, with an armful of books she had borrowed from the library. "I am not," Alaric said, though the correction came a half-second too late to be convincing. "You are," Doran said, leaning against the railing beside him. "It is a strange thing to see. I do not think I have seen it since your father's time, and even then it was rare." Alaric did not answer immediately. He watched Elena disappear around a corner, still smiling, apparently, without having noticed it himself. "She does not know who I am," he said finally. "Not really. Not the way everyone else does." "You could tell her," Doran pointed out. "It would take one sentence. My name is Alaric. It is not difficult. I know." And yet, Alaric agreed, and said nothing further, because he did not fully understand the answer himself, only that some part of him was not ready to give up the strange, quiet freedom of being called by the wrong name, by the one person in his life who did not yet know enough to be afraid of the right one. Doran studied him for a long moment, something knowing in his expression. "The court is talking," he said eventually. "You should know that. Some of them think it is a weakness, letting the mistake stand this long. Others think it is something else entirely. Let them think what they like." "That is easy to say from up here," Doran said. "Harder to maintain when Councilman Thackeray starts asking pointed questions in open session." Alaric's jaw tightened slightly at the mention of the councilman's name. Ewan Thackeray was old enough to remember Alaric's father clearly, and he had never fully accepted that the son who had replaced him was capable of holding the same authority. Any perceived weakness, any crack in the careful armor Alaric had spent 11 years building, would be seized upon and examined from every possible angle. "Let him ask," Alaric said, though there was less certainty in his voice than he would have liked. That evening, he found himself in the garden again, half hoping and half dreading that Elena would appear there, as she had the night before. She did, eventually, wrapped in a light coat against the evening chill, her hair loose in a way that made her look younger, softer, less like a researcher who had wandered into a world far stranger than she had been prepared for, and more like someone who had simply always belonged in the quiet dark of that particular garden. "You look like you are thinking too hard about something," she said, settling onto the low stone wall beside him. "I often am," he admitted. "Want to tell me about it?" He considered the question longer than it perhaps warranted. There was so much he could not tell her, Not yet, not without unraveling the fragile, careful thing that had grown between them over the past few days. But there was, he found, quite a lot he could tell her, if he chose his words with care. "I am thinking about how strange it is," he said, "to be looked at the way you look at me. Without expectation, without calculation. I had forgotten what that felt like, if I ever knew it at all." Elena was quiet for a moment, watching him with an expression he could not quite read. "That sounds lonely," she said finally. "It has been," he admitted, surprising himself with the honesty of it. "For a very long time." "Well," she said, a small, warm smile touching her mouth, "I suppose you will just have to keep putting up with me looking at you the wrong way then." "I suppose I will," he said, and found, as the words left him, that he meant them more sincerely than he had meant almost anything in years. They talked for a long time after that, about small things mostly, the kind of ordinary conversation Alaric had almost forgotten how to have. She told him about the research she had left behind, half finished, when the transfer orders had come through. He told her, carefully, about the gardens, about how his mother had designed them before he was born, about the particular flowers that only bloomed at night and only in the coldest part of the year, as though they had been built to defy every expectation placed on them. Neither of them mentioned his name again. But when Elena finally rose to return to her room, and Alaric watched her go, he understood with sudden clarity that whatever careful arrangement they had fallen into, whatever quiet, unspoken agreement to leave the mistake uncorrected, would not be able to last forever. Somewhere out beyond the garden walls, the court was watching and waiting, and eventually, someone was going to force the truth into the light, whether either of them was ready for it or not. He simply hoped, standing there in the dark with the scent of night-blooming flowers thick in the air, that when it happened, it would not cost him the one thing in 11 years of careful, guarded rule that had finally begun to feel like something worth protecting. The trouble, when it started, did not come from the council or from any grand political scheme. It came from something as ordinary as dinner. 2 weeks into her stay, Elena had settled into a routine that felt, in its own strange way, almost comfortable. She spent her mornings in the library, working through research notes that made increasingly little sense without proper equipment. She spent her afternoons exploring the estate, discovering new corridors and hidden rooms she had not known existed. And in the evenings, more often than not, she found her way to the garden, where Alaric, still Kalen to her, though she was beginning to suspect that was not quite right either, would already be waiting, or would arrive shortly after. It was at dinner, seated once again at the long table with the household staff arranged carefully around her, that Elena first pushed back against the strange, unspoken rules everyone else seemed to follow without question. "This is too spicy," she said, setting down her fork after the second course had been served. "I asked for it mild yesterday, and nobody listened." The table went quiet. A young server near the kitchen door froze mid-step, a tray balanced in her hands. "The kitchen prepares the meal, as it is prepared," said one of the older staff members, a stern woman named Greta, who oversaw the household with an iron sense of propriety. "It is not customized to individual preference." "Well, it should be," Elena said, entirely unbothered by the tension rippling through the room. "I am not trying to be difficult. I just cannot eat something this spicy without my eyes watering, and that seems like a reasonable thing to mention." Greta's mouth tightened into a thin line, and for a moment, Elena thought she might actually be reprimanded, right there at the table, in front of everyone. But before anything further could be said, a voice from the head of the table interrupted, quiet, but carrying easily across the room. "Have it remade for her," Alaric said, without looking up from his own plate, mild, as she asked. The room's tension did not dissolve so much as transform, shifting from one kind of surprise into another. Nobody argued. Nobody questioned it. But Elena noticed the glances exchanged around the table, quick and meaningful, and she understood, though she could not have said exactly how, that she had just watched something unprecedented happen twice in the same fortnight. Later that evening, walking the corridor back toward her room, she was intercepted by Doran, who fell into step beside her, with an expression that was carefully neutral, though his eyes gave away something closer to concern. "You should be more careful," he said, without preamble. "About the food?" Elena asked, genuinely confused. "It was just a comment." "It is never just a comment here," Doran said. Nothing is. Every word you speak in that hall is measured, weighed, filed away by everyone present to be discussed later, in smaller rooms, among people who do not have your best interests in mind. Elena stopped walking. That sounds exhausting. It is the way things are, Doran said. It has always been the way things are. And the fact that he keeps accommodating you, keeps letting things pass, that he would never have let pass from anyone else, is starting to draw attention. Attention you may not want. What kind of attention? Doran hesitated, and in that hesitation, Elena caught a glimpse of something she had not expected from him. Genuine worry. There are people in this court who have spent years positioning themselves carefully around him, he said. People who understand exactly how much power comes from knowing precisely what he wants and shaping themselves to provide it. You do none of that. You do not seem to understand the game at all, and that makes you either very safe, because you are no threat to anyone's position, or very dangerous, because nobody can predict what you might do next. I am not playing a game, Elena said. I am just being myself. I know, Doran said, and something in his voice softened. That is precisely the problem. He left her there in the corridor, and Elena stood alone for a long moment, turning his words over in her mind. She had not thought of herself as dangerous. She had not thought of herself as anything, really, beyond a person trying to navigate an unfamiliar place, with as much honesty and as little pretense as she could manage. But perhaps, she was beginning to understand, honesty itself was the rarest and most disruptive thing a person could bring into a place built entirely on careful, practiced performance. She found Alaric in the garden that night, as she had come to expect, though his expression, when she approached, carried a weight she had not seen there before. Doran spoke to you, he said. It was not a question. He did. He is not wrong to worry, Alaric said, though I wish, for once, he would keep his worry to himself. Is it true? Elena asked. What he said, about people watching everything I do, waiting to see what it means. Alaric was quiet for a moment, and when he finally answered, there was something tired in his voice, the weight of 11 years pressing through every word. It is true. I wish it were not. I have spent my entire life inside walls built on exactly that kind of careful, constant observation. I forget, sometimes, that it is not normal. That most people do not live their lives being watched so closely. Does it bother you? Elena asked. Being watched like that? It used to, he admitted. I stopped noticing it, eventually. Or perhaps I simply stopped caring. It is easier, in a position like mine, to accept it as the price of everything else. But watching it happen to you, watching people study you and calculate you, and try to determine what you mean simply by existing near me, that bothers me more than it ever did on my own behalf. Elena moved closer, settling onto the stone wall beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Then let them watch, she said. I am not going to start pretending to be someone I am not, just because it makes people nervous. Something in his expression shifted, softened, and for a moment, the weight he had been carrying seemed to lift, just slightly, replaced by something warmer. No, he said. I do not suppose you will, and I find, against every instinct that has kept me alive this long, that I do not want you to. They sat together as the evening deepened around them, and though neither of them spoke of it directly, both understood that something had been decided in that quiet exchange. Whatever came next, whatever the court's careful calculations eventually produced, Elena was not going to change who she was to fit the shape everyone else expected. And Alaric, for the first time since taking his father's place at the head of that long table, found himself choosing, deliberately and with open eyes, to stand beside someone who refused to bend. It was, he thought, watching her profile in the fading light, either the beginning of something extraordinary or the first crack in a foundation that had held steady for 11 careful, guarded years. He was no longer certain he cared which it turned out to be. By the third week, the whispers had grown too loud to ignore, even for someone as determined as Elena to remain unbothered by the court's opinion of her. She heard fragments of it everywhere, in the pause of conversation when she entered a room, in the careful sideways glances of servants who had grown used to her presence, but not comfortable with it, in the way certain members of the household staff had begun addressing her with a formality that felt less like respect and more like distance. She mentioned it to Leora one afternoon, the two of them seated in a small sitting room that had become, over the past weeks, something like a refuge for both of them. People are talking about me, Elena said. I do not know what they are saying exactly, but I can feel it. Leora set down the cup of tea she had been holding, her expression carefully composed in a way that told Elena she already knew precisely what was being said. They are talking, Leora confirmed. It would be strange if they were not, given the circumstances. What circumstances exactly? I still do not fully understand what I have done that is so remarkable. I called him the wrong name once, by accident, and somehow that has become the most interesting thing to happen in this court in years. It is not the mistake itself, Leora said. It is what has happened since. 3 weeks, Elena. 3 weeks, and he has not corrected you. Not once. Do you understand how significant that is? I have watched him correct visiting dignitaries for far smaller errors. I have watched him end conversations entirely over less. And with you, nothing. Not a single word. Elena turned this over in her mind, trying to fit it against everything else she had observed since arriving. Maybe he just does not think it matters that much. Leora's expression turned almost pitying. Elena, it matters more than almost anything else in this world. Names here are not simply words. They are inheritance. They are power. Letting someone use the wrong one, and letting it stand, publicly, repeatedly, without correction, is as close to an admission as he is capable of making. An admission of what? Leora hesitated, glancing toward the door, as though checking for listeners before lowering her voice further. That you matter to him, more than protocol, more, perhaps, than he is entirely comfortable admitting even to himself. The words settled over Elena with unexpected weight. She had sensed, in a vague, half-formed way, that something was shifting between herself and the man she still thought of, out of habit now, more than confusion, as Kalen. But hearing it spoken aloud, framed in the language of the court's careful, watching eyes, made it feel suddenly real, in a way it had not before. You should be careful, Leora added, echoing almost exactly what Doran had told her weeks earlier. There are people here who will not be pleased by what this means, Councilman Thackeray especially. He has never fully accepted Alaric's rule, not truly, and any sign of what he would call weakness will be used against him. Against you as well, if you are not careful. I do not know how to be careful about something I did not even mean to start, Elena said, and there was real frustration in her voice now. The accumulated weight of weeks spent trying to navigate a world whose rules she had never been properly taught. I know, Leora said, softer now, reaching out to touch her hand briefly. I am not saying it to frighten you. I am saying it because I care what happens to you, and I do not think you fully understand the position you are in. Then tell me, Elena said. Tell me plainly. What should I do? Leora was quiet for a long moment, weighing her words carefully. Be careful with names, she said finally. That is the only advice I can give you that will actually help. Watch what you call him, in front of others especially, and if the moment ever comes when someone forces the truth into the open, be ready for it. Because it will come. Nothing stays hidden in a place like this. Not forever. Elena nodded, though the warning, delivered as it was in vague, careful language, did not fully land the way Leora had perhaps hoped. She understood, in an abstract sense, that there was danger somewhere in the situation she had found herself in. But 3 weeks of quiet gardens and honest conversation had softened the edges of that danger, until it felt distant, theoretical, the kind of warning one nods along to without truly absorbing. It was a mistake she would not fully understand until much later. That evening, at dinner, Councilman Ewan Thackeray was present for the first time since Elena's arrival, seated near the head of the table in a chair that placed him uncomfortably close to her own. He was an old man, his hair entirely silver, his eyes sharp in a way that reminded Elena uncomfortably of a bird watching for movement in tall grass. You are the researcher, he said. Not quite a question, partway through the first course. The one everyone has been discussing. I did not realize I was quite so interesting, Elena said, keeping her tone light despite the sudden tightness in her chest. Interesting is one word for it, Thackeray said, his gaze flicking briefly toward the head of the table, where Alaric sat in careful, composed silence. I have known this court for a very long time, Miss Marsh. I knew this king's father, and his father before him, I have watched a great many things change here over the years, and a great many things stay exactly the same. Names, in particular, tend to stay the same. I am sorry if I have caused offense, Elena said carefully. It was never my intention. Intention rarely matters as much as consequence, Thackeray said, his voice pleasant, almost conversational, which made the words land harder than any raised voice could have managed. I wonder, sometimes, whether the young understand that. Whether they understand that the things they do without thinking can echo far longer than they expect. The rest of the meal passed in careful, guarded conversation, but Elena felt the councilman's eyes on her for the remainder of the evening, weighing, calculating, filing away everything she said and did for some purpose she could not yet guess. When she finally excused herself and made her way toward the garden, hoping to find some quiet after the tension of the meal, she found Alaric already there, his expression grim in a way she had not seen from him before. "He spoke to you," Alaric said. "He did. I am sorry. I should have warned you he would be present tonight. I did not expect him this early." "He seemed to be warning me about something," Elena said, though he was too careful to say what, exactly. Alaric's jaw tightened. "He is testing the waters, seeing how much he can push before either of us reacts. He will not stop there. What is he going to do?" Alaric did not answer immediately, and in his silence, Elena felt, for the first time since arriving at Blackthorn, the true weight of what Leora and Doran had both been trying, in their careful, incomplete ways, to warn her about. Whatever quiet peace had settled between herself and Alaric over the past 3 weeks, it existed inside a much larger, much more dangerous world, one that was already beginning to close in around them both. Despite Thackeray's careful veiled warning, the days that followed settled into something almost peaceful. Elena told herself it was because the old councilman's words had been nothing more than an attempt to unsettle her, a small display of power meant to remind her of her place within a court she did not fully understand. She did not entirely believe that explanation, but it was easier to hold on to than the alternative, and so she held on to it anyway. Alaric, for his part, seemed determined to prove that nothing had truly changed. He sought her out more often now, not just in the garden but during the day as well, finding small excuses to walk with her through the halls, to sit with her in the library while she worked through her notes, to simply be near her in the quiet, unremarkable moments that made up the ordinary texture of a day. It was during one of these moments, seated together in the library on a rainy afternoon when the gardens were too wet to visit, that Elena finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been sitting at the back of her mind since that first morning in the garden. "Will you tell me your real name?" she asked. "Not because I need to use it. I have grown rather fond of Kaelin, honestly. But because I would like to know it. Because I would like to know you, properly, all the way through." Alaric was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the rain streaking down the tall windows. "Alaric," he said finally. "Alaric Draven." Elena turned the name over in her mind, testing its shape. "Alaric," she repeated softly. "It suits you. Does it?" "It sounds like someone who has carried a great deal of weight for a very long time," she said, "and still manages to stand up straight under it." Something in his expression shifted, warmed, in a way that made Elena's chest tighten pleasantly. "I have never thought of it that way," he said. "Most people who use my name use it as a demand, a reminder of everything I am supposed to be. You make it sound like something else entirely." "Maybe it just depends on who is saying it," Elena said. "Maybe," he agreed. And for a long moment neither of them spoke, the rain filling the silence between them with something that felt, despite everything, remarkably peaceful. It was in that library, over the following days, that Elena began to see glimpses of the man beneath the king, more clearly than she ever had before. He told her about his mother, who had died when he was young, and about the gardens she had designed as a place of quiet, in a life that had never truly belonged to her either. He told her about his father, a man who had ruled with an iron discipline that had left little room for warmth, and about the long, lonely years of learning to rule in his shadow. "I used to think," he told her one afternoon, "that being alpha meant becoming someone else entirely. Someone without doubt, without softness, without anything that could be used against me. I spent years building that person. I got very good at it. And now?" Elena asked. "Now I am not so certain that person was ever real. he said. Or perhaps he was real, and simply very tired, and it took someone calling me by the wrong name for a month before I remembered there was anyone else underneath. Elena reached out, without fully deciding to, and took his hand. He did not pull away. I like the someone else underneath, she said. Very much, actually. That is fortunate, he said, his voice quieter now. Because I find I like him rather more myself, when you are the one looking at him. The moment stretched between them, warm and fragile, the kind of moment that felt too delicate to name aloud for fear of breaking it. But even as Elena sat there, her hand in his, some small, cautious part of her mind returned to Leora's warning, to Doran's careful concern, to the sharp, calculating eyes of Councilman Thackeray across the dinner table. Something was building beyond the walls of that quiet library, something neither of them could see clearly yet, and no amount of warmth between them was going to stop it from arriving. She pushed the thought aside, as she had grown accustomed to doing over the past weeks, and let herself simply exist in the moment instead, the rain falling steadily outside, the fire crackling low in the hearth, and the man beside her, Alaric now instead of Kalen, though she suspected she would always think of him as both, looking at her as though she were the first genuinely unguarded thing he had encountered in 11 long, careful years. It could not last. Some part of her knew that even then. But for those few quiet days, held safe within the walls of the library and the garden, and the small, ordinary moments they carved out for themselves between council meetings and careful court politics, it did not need to last forever. It only needed to be real, for as long as it lasted, and it was more real than anything Elena had known in a very long time. The council chamber at Blackthorn was a circular room, lined with old portraits, each one depicting an alpha king or queen from generations past, their painted eyes seeming to follow the proceedings below with silent, judgmental patience. It was here, 4 weeks after Elena's arrival, that Councilman Ewan Thackeray finally brought the matter of her presence into formal discussion. Alaric had not wanted to hold this particular session. He had delayed it twice already, citing other pressing matters, but the council's patience, like most things in Blackthorn, had limits, and Doran had warned him that further delay would only make the eventual confrontation worse. There is a matter, Thackeray began, once the routine business of the session had concluded, that I believe requires the council's attention. Alaric felt the shift in the room before Thackeray even finished his sentence. The subtle straightening of postures around the circular table, the careful, expectant silence that fell over the assembled council members. He had known this moment was coming. He had simply hoped, foolishly perhaps, that he might have more time before it arrived. The matter of the human researcher, Thackeray continued, and the manner in which she has been permitted to address you. Elena Marsh is a guest of this court, Alaric said, keeping his voice level with the same practiced control he had spent 11 years perfecting. Her presence here is a matter of research cooperation, nothing more. And yet, Thackeray said, his tone maddeningly reasonable, she has addressed you incorrectly, repeatedly, over the course of a full month, and you have not once corrected her. I do not say this to embarrass you, my king. I say it because it is a fact, observed by nearly everyone in this room, and facts, left unaddressed, have a way of becoming precedent. A murmur moved around the table, quiet but unmistakable. Alaric glanced at the faces of the assembled council members and saw, in most of them, a careful neutrality that told him they were waiting to see which way the wind would blow before committing themselves to a position. I fail to see how a simple misunderstanding constitutes a matter for formal council discussion, Alaric said. Because it is no longer simply a misunderstanding, Thackeray said. It has become a symbol. Among the staff, among the younger members of this court, there is talk that the Alpha King has permitted a stranger, a human stranger no less, to disregard the most basic protocols of address, without consequence. Some see it as a curiosity, others see it as weakness. I confess, my king, that I am beginning to lean toward the latter interpretation myself. Alaric felt his jaw tighten, the old, familiar discipline of 11 years fighting against the sharp, protective anger rising in his chest. Careful, councilman. I mean no disrespect, Thackeray said, though the words carried a careful edge that suggested otherwise. I mean only to raise a concern that others in this room share, but have been reluctant to voice. Your father built this court on discipline, on the understanding that every word, every gesture, Every small formality mattered, because it was the accumulation of those small formalities that held the larger structure together. If we allow that structure to erode over something as simple as a name, what stops it from eroding further? The room was silent, waiting. Alaric looked around the table, at faces he had known for years, some of whom had served his father before him, and understood, with sudden clarity, that Thackeray was not speaking only for himself. This was a challenge, carefully worded, carefully positioned, designed to force him into a corner from which there were only two paths forward: correct Elena publicly, formally, and reassert the old rules in front of everyone who had been watching, or refuse, and hand Thackeray the exact evidence of weakness he needed to build his case further. "I will consider your concerns," Alaric said finally, his voice giving away nothing. "With respect, my king," Thackeray pressed. "Consideration has already stretched across a full month. The court grows restless, waiting for a decision either way." "Then the court will continue to wait," Alaric said, with enough finality in his tone that even Thackeray seemed to understand the conversation, for now, had reached its end. The session concluded shortly after, but the tension it had stirred did not dissipate with it. Alaric remained in the council chamber long after the other members had filed out, staring up at the portraits of his ancestors, each one seeming to demand something of him he was not certain he was prepared to give. Doran found him there an hour later, the room empty and quiet, lit only by the fading afternoon light through the tall windows. "That went about as well as I expected," Doran said, settling into a chair nearby. "He is building a case against me," Alaric said, slowly, carefully, using her as the evidence. "He is," Doran agreed, "and he will not stop. Not until you give him what he wants, or until he finds another angle to attack from." "What does he want?" "The same thing he has always wanted," Doran said. "For you to prove you are your father's son. Rigid, predictable, bound entirely by the old rules, with no room for anything that does not fit neatly within them." Alaric was quiet for a long moment. "And if I am not willing to give him that, then he will keep looking for cracks," Doran said simply. "And Elena, I am afraid, has become the largest crack he has found in 11 years. The weight of that settled over Alaric heavily. He had known, on some level, that his growing closeness with Elena carried risk. He had simply not fully reckoned with how quickly that risk could be turned into a weapon by someone determined to use it against him. He found Elena that evening in the garden, as he so often did now, and something in his expression must have given away the weight of the day, because she rose immediately from the stone wall where she had been sitting, and crossed to him with visible concern. "What happened?" she asked. "The council discussed you today," he said, deciding there was no point in softening it. "Thackeray, specifically. He believes I am showing weakness by allowing you to address me incorrectly. He believes it is eroding the structure of the court." Elena's face paled slightly. "Because of the name?" "Because of everything the name represents," Alaric said. "To men like Thackeray, it is not simply a mistake. It is a symbol of change he does not want to accept, and he will use it, use us, if it helps him hold on to the world he understands." "What do we do?" Elena asked, and Alaric heard, in the question, the same steady courage that had drawn him to her in the first place. No trace of panic, only a clear, direct desire to face whatever was coming, rather than hide from it. "I do not know yet," he admitted. "But I do know this. I am not going to correct you simply because Thackeray has decided it would be convenient for him if I did. Whatever happens next, it will happen because it is the right choice, not because an old man in a council chamber has decided to test how far he can push me." Elena reached for his hand, and he took it without hesitation, the two of them standing together in the deepening dark of the garden, the weight of the coming days pressing down on them both, unspoken but unmistakably present. "I am not afraid of him," Elena said. "I know," Alaric said. "That is exactly what worries me." Because he understood, even as he said it, that her fearlessness, the very thing that had drawn him to her, the very thing that had made her different from every carefully calculated person who had ever stood in that garden with him, was about to be tested in ways neither of them could fully anticipate. Thackeray was patient. He had waited 11 years to find a weakness worth exploiting, and now that he had found one, he was not going to let it go easily. Somewhere in the estate, in rooms Alaric could not see and conversations he could not hear, The pieces were already being arranged for whatever confrontation was coming. All he could do now was decide, clearly and deliberately, which side of that confrontation he was prepared to stand on when it finally arrived. The opportunity Thackeray had been waiting for arrived in the form of a formal gathering, held to welcome a visiting alpha from a neighboring territory, a sharp-eyed man named Cassian Vane, who ruled a smaller but fiercely proud pack to the north. Such gatherings were rare and carried significant weight, every word and gesture scrutinized not only by the members of Blackthorn's own court, but by outside eyes as well, eyes that would carry stories of what they witnessed back to their own territories. Elena had been invited, or perhaps required, to attend. Alaric had considered, briefly, finding some excuse to keep her away, some way to shield her from the exposure of a room full of watching strangers. But he had also understood, with the same clarity that had guided him through 11 years of careful rule, that hiding her would only confirm every suspicion Thackeray had been trying to plant. So she attended, dressed in a deep blue gown that Leora had helped her select, standing near the edge of the great hall as the formal proceedings began. For the first hour, everything proceeded smoothly. Cassian Vane was received with the appropriate ceremony. Toasts were raised. Careful diplomatic conversation flowed around the hall in the practiced rhythms Elena had come to recognize over her weeks at Blackthorn. She stayed near the edges, watching, careful not to draw attention, though she could feel Alaric's presence across the room, even when she was not looking directly at him, a kind of gravity she had grown accustomed to without fully realizing it. It was during a lull in the formal proceedings, as guests mingled and conversation grew looser, that Thackeray made his move. He approached Elena directly, in full view of a cluster of court members, and, more importantly, within easy earshot of Cassian Vane, who stood nearby in conversation with two of his own advisors. "Miss Marsh," Thackeray said, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry, "I understand. You have been a guest of our king for some weeks now. Tell me, how do you find him? Kalen, was it you called him?" Elena felt the trap close around her before she fully understood its shape. She glanced toward Alaric, but he was several steps away, deep in conversation with Cassian's advisors, unaware of what was unfolding. "I misheard his name when I first arrived," Elena said carefully, aware now of the eyes turning toward her, drawn by the deliberate volume of Thackeray's question. "It has simply become a habit." "A habit," Thackeray repeated, loud enough now that conversation nearby began to quiet, heads turning with the particular hunger of an audience, sensing drama about to unfold. "A month-long habit, unaddressed by the man himself. How curious. I wonder, does the visiting alpha know that the king who sits before him tonight cannot even be bothered to correct a stranger who does not know his own name?" Cassian Vane's attention shifted immediately, his sharp eyes moving between Thackeray and Elena with obvious interest. "Is that true?" he asked, directing the question not at Elena but toward the room at large, his voice carrying the particular satisfaction of someone who had just been handed useful information. The hall had gone properly quiet now, the way it had that very first afternoon in this same room, though this silence carried a different weight entirely, sharp and public and impossible to escape. Elena felt her face heat, humiliation crawling up her neck as she realized, too late, exactly what Thackeray had orchestrated. This was not a careless question. This was a carefully staged exposure, designed to embarrass Elena, and, through her, to embarrass Alaric, in front of a visiting alpha, whose good opinion mattered, for reasons of politics and pride both. "I did not realize it was a matter for public discussion," Elena said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the growing weight of the room's attention. "Everything in this court is a matter for public discussion," Thackeray said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "That is rather the point, Miss Marsh." Cassian Vane laughed, a short, sharp sound that carried easily across the now silent hall. "A month," he said, shaking his head with obvious amusement. "I have heard many things about Blackthorn's discipline over the years. I confess, this is not what I expected to find." The words landed like a physical blow. Elena saw, in the faces around her, the mixture of second-hand embarrassment and cruel curiosity that came from watching someone else's humiliation unfold in real time. She searched for something to say, some way to defend herself or Alaric or both, but every option that came to mind felt inadequate against the careful trap Thackeray had built. It was in that frozen, terrible moment, the entire hall watching and waiting, that Elena finally understood the full weight of every warning Leora and Doran had tried to give her. This was what they had meant. This was the danger they had seen coming from the very beginning, and she had walked directly into it, too caught up in the quiet, private warmth of the garden to fully prepare herself for the sharp, public cruelty of a room like this one. "Miss Marsh," Thackeray pressed, his voice softer now but no less pointed. "Perhaps you would care to correct yourself. Here. Now. In front of our guest." Elena opened her mouth, though she was not entirely certain what she intended to say, humiliation and confusion warring inside her chest. But before a single word could leave her, another voice cut across the hall, low and unmistakably commanding, silencing every other sound in the room instantly. "That will not be necessary." Alaric had crossed the distance between them without Elena noticing, his expression carrying none of the careful, guarded neutrality she had grown used to seeing him wear in public. Instead, there was something sharper there, something close to the controlled fury of a man who had just watched someone he cared for, deliberately backed into a corner for the sole purpose of political theater. "My king," Thackeray began, "I only meant to clarify a matter of court protocol, for the benefit of our guest." "You meant to humiliate her," Alaric said, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall, in front of a visiting alpha, "for your own purposes. Do not insult my intelligence by pretending otherwise." The hall had gone utterly still now, every eye fixed on the two of them. Thackeray pale but holding his ground, Alaric standing beside Elena with a protectiveness that needed no further explanation to anyone watching. Cassian Vane, sensing the shift in the room, had gone quiet as well, watching with sharp, calculating interest as the confrontation he had inadvertently stumbled into unfolded in front of him. "With respect," Thackeray said, his voice tighter now, "the court has a right to know why its king has permitted this particular irregularity to continue unaddressed for so long." Alaric was quiet for a long moment, the entire hall holding its breath around him. And then, with a calm that carried far more weight than any raised voice could have managed, he began to speak, his words landing into the silence like stones dropped into still water, each one sending ripples through the watching crowd that would not settle for a long time to come. "Very well, councilman," Alaric said, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the silent hall. "You want an answer? You shall have one, in front of everyone here, since you seem so determined that this matter be settled publicly, rather than left to my own discretion." He turned, not toward Thackeray, but toward the room at large, his gaze moving slowly across the assembled faces, court members and staff, and the visiting Alpha's own advisors, all of them watching with the same held-breath attention. "For 11 years, Alaric said, "I have been addressed by my title before my name in nearly every conversation I have had. My name, when it is spoken at all, is spoken with the full weight of everything it represents attached to it. Every treaty my father signed, every war his father fought, every expectation this court has built across generations, all of it pressed into a single word every time someone says it to me." He paused, and in the silence, Elena felt her own heart pounding, uncertain where this was going, uncertain whether it would end in her protection or her further exposure. "When Elena Marsh arrived here a month ago," Alaric continued, "she misheard my name during her introduction. It was an honest mistake, made by someone who did not yet understand the weight this court places on such things. I could have corrected her in that moment. It would have taken a single sentence. Instead, I said nothing." A murmur moved through the hall, quiet but unmistakable, though Alaric continued before it could grow into anything louder. "I said nothing," he repeated, "because for the first time in 11 years, someone in this court was speaking directly to me, rather than to the crown I carry. Not to the king, not to the weight of my father's legacy, or the expectations built into every syllable of my true name, simply to me. I did not realize, until it happened, how much I had been missing that, how much I had built an entire life around never being seen that way by anyone." His eyes found Elena's across the small distance between them, and something in his expression softened, even as his voice remained steady and clear enough to carry across the whole silent hall. "I let the mistake stand," he said. "Not out of weakness, councilman, as you have suggested, but because it was the truest thing anyone had offered me in longer than I care to admit. And if that makes me weak in your eyes, then I am content to be weak in exactly that particular way, because I have spent 11 years being strong in every other way this court has demanded of me, and I find I am tired of being nothing more than the sum of expectations placed on me before I was even old enough to understand what they meant. The hall remained silent for a long moment after he finished speaking, the weight of his words settling over the room. Thackeray, for his part, seemed to have no ready response, his careful trap having sprung in a direction he had not anticipated, exposing not weakness, but something far harder to attack. An honesty so direct it left no room for the kind of political maneuvering he had built his entire strategy around. It was Cassian Vane, unexpectedly, who broke the silence, his earlier amusement replaced by something that looked almost like respect. "I have known many alphas in my time," he said, his voice carrying an easy, genuine warmth that had been absent from his earlier laughter. "Most of them would rather die than admit weakness in front of a room like this one. I confess, my king, I find myself more impressed by what I just witnessed than I would have been by any display of rigid discipline. There is a strength in honesty that discipline alone cannot manufacture." The tide of the room shifted visibly at his words, the earlier cruel curiosity softening into something closer to genuine interest, even, in some faces, quiet admiration. Elena felt the tension in her chest begin to ease, though she remained acutely aware that Thackeray's careful, calculating gaze had not softened at all, still watching, still calculating, even as the room around him had turned against his intended narrative. "My king," Thackeray said finally, his voice tight but controlled, "I meant no disrespect. I raised the matter only out of concern for the traditions this court has always upheld." "I understand your concern, Councilman," Alaric said, and though his voice remained even, there was a new edge to it now, one that made clear the conversation, whatever polite words continued to be exchanged, had fundamentally shifted in his favor. "But traditions exist to serve the people who uphold them, not the other way around. If a tradition can only be maintained by publicly humiliating a guest of this court, then perhaps it is the tradition, and not the person who forgot it, that requires examination." Thackeray had no answer for that. He bowed, stiffly, and withdrew from the immediate circle of attention, though Elena did not miss the sharp, unreadable look he cast toward her as he went, the look of a man who had lost this particular confrontation but had not, she suspected, entirely given up the larger war. The formal gathering resumed its careful rhythms shortly after, conversation slowly filling the hall again, though the atmosphere had changed irrevocably, charged now with something new, something that would be discussed and rediscussed in quiet corners of the estate for weeks to come. Elena found herself, for the remainder of the evening, treated with a kind of careful curiosity, rather than the guarded distance she had grown used to. Court members approaching her with questions and observations that carried genuine interest rather than calculated suspicion. It was not until much later, when the hall had finally emptied and the last of the guests had retired for the evening, that Elena found herself alone with Alaric again, standing near the tall windows where the moonlight fell, in pale silver strips across the stone floor. "You did not have to say all of that," she said quietly, in front of everyone. "I did," he said, turning to face her fully. "I have spent 11 years letting other people decide what I was allowed to feel and say in that hall. Tonight, for the first time, I decided for myself. It felt, strangely, like the first honest thing I have done as king." Elena stepped closer, close enough now that she could see the exhaustion beneath the steadiness of his expression, the toll the evening's confrontation had taken on him despite the calm he had projected throughout it. "Thank you," she said, "for defending me. And for being honest, even though it cost you something to do it." "It cost me nothing," he said, "compared to what it would have cost me to watch you humiliated and say nothing at all." He reached out, gently, and took her hand. "I am done pretending that what has grown between us over this past month is something I need to hide or minimize for the sake of protocol. Thackeray may not accept it. Some part of this court may never fully accept it. But I find, standing here with you now, that I do not particularly care what they accept, so long as you are still standing beside me when this is over." Elena's heart swelled with something warm and certain, the fear and tension of the evening finally beginning to loosen its grip on her chest. "I am not going anywhere," she said. "Good," Alaric said, and for the first time since she had known him, he smiled fully, unguarded, the expression transforming his face into something Elena suspected very few people in this court had ever been fortunate enough to witness. Because I find I have grown rather attached to the sound of my own wrong name, when it comes from you. In the days that followed the confrontation in the Great Hall, something in Blackthorn Court shifted permanently, though the change was quieter and slower than Elena had expected. Thackeray did not disappear entirely, and his careful, watchful presence remained a constant reminder that not everyone had accepted the new shape of things. But his influence, once so sharp and confident, had visibly dulled, the story of that evening spreading through the court in versions that grew more favorable to Alaric and Elena with each retelling, until even the councilman's own allies seemed hesitant to raise the matter again. Leora found Elena in the garden a week later, the same quiet corner where so much of what had happened between Elena and Alaric had first begun to take shape. "I owe you an apology," Leora said, settling onto the stone wall beside her. "I warned you to be careful, but I never truly explained what I meant, not clearly enough. I think, if I am honest, I did not fully understand it myself until I watched him defend you in that hall." "You do not owe me anything," Elena said. "You tried to warn me. I simply was not ready to hear it yet." "Perhaps," Leora said, "or perhaps some things cannot be explained properly until they have already happened. I have known my brother his entire life, Elena. I have never seen him speak the way he did that night. Not to our father, not to the council, not to anyone. Whatever this is between you, it has changed him. For the better, I think, though it terrified me at first to watch it happen." Elena smiled, warmth spreading through her chest at the confirmation of something she had begun to suspect but had not yet fully allowed herself to believe. "It has changed me too," she admitted. "I came here as a researcher, on what I thought was a temporary assignment. I did not expect to find any of this." "Life rarely announces its most important moments in advance," Leora said, a knowing smile touching her mouth. "It simply arrives, and asks you to decide what to do with it once it has already changed everything." That evening, Alaric found Elena in the library, the same room where he had first told her his true name. Rain-soaked windows, now replaced by clear evening light that spilled gold across the tall shelves. He carried something with him, a small, carefully wrapped item that he set down on the table beside her without explanation, watching her expression as she unwrapped it. Inside was a simple pendant, unadorned except for a single word engraved along its edge, small enough that she had to hold it close to read it clearly. Not Alaric, not Kaelin, simply a small symbol, an old mark she did not recognize, that seemed to represent something quieter and more personal than either name had carried. "What is this?" she asked. "An old custom," he said, "older even than the formal titles this court insists on. In the years before names carried the weight of thrones and treaties, this mark was given between two people who had chosen to see each other clearly, without the noise of everything else attached. My mother wore one. I found it among her things, years ago, and never understood why until now." Elena's throat tightened with sudden emotion, the weight of the gesture settling over her fully. "Alaric," she said softly, testing the name properly now, deliberately, no longer a mistake but a choice. "Elena," he said in return, and something in the simple exchange of names, spoken clearly, and without any of the careful protocol that had governed every other conversation in that court, felt like the truest thing either of them had ever offered each other. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what happens next. You came here for research. That assignment will end eventually, and when it does, you will have every right to return to the life you left behind." "And if I do not want to?" Elena asked. "Then I would very much like you to stay," he said, the careful composure he wore so easily, in every other setting, slipping away entirely now, replaced by something honest and slightly uncertain, the expression of a man asking for something he genuinely feared might be refused. "Not as a researcher, not as a guest passing through, as whatever it is we have already become to each other, whatever name that deserves, if it deserves one at all." Elena reached for his hand, the pendant still warm from where it had rested against her palm. "I think," she said, "that some things do not need a name to be real. But if you are asking whether I want to stay, the answer is yes. It has been yes for longer than I think either of us has been willing to admit." The following weeks brought changes both large and small to Blackthorn Court. Thackeray, sensing the shifting tide fully now, grew quieter in council sessions, his careful challenges softening into something closer to reluctant acceptance. The staff, who had once watched Elena with wary uncertainty, grew warmer, more familiar, treating her less like an unpredictable variable, and more like a fixture of the household she had, in truth, become. Even Doran, ever careful and watchful, allowed himself small moments of open approval whenever he found the two of them together in the garden or the library, the quiet places that had first given their strange, unlikely bond room to grow. On a clear evening several months after her arrival, Elena stood once more in the garden where it had all begun, Alaric beside her, the tree line beyond the low stone wall silhouetted against a sky just beginning to darken into evening. She thought back to that first terrified moment in the great hall, the silence that had followed her honest mistake, the fear in Leora's eyes, the strange, unreadable flicker at the corner of Alaric's mouth that she had not understood at the time, but had come to recognize, over the months since, as the very first sign of everything that would follow. "Do you regret it?" she asked him, "letting the mistake stand for so long?" "Never," he said, without hesitation. "It gave me the truest thing I have ever known. If I had corrected you that first day, the way protocol demanded, I do not know that either of us would be standing here now." "And what do I call you now?" Elena asked, a teasing warmth in her voice. "Now that the whole court knows the truth, and Kaylan is no longer a mistake worth protecting?" Alaric considered the question with mock seriousness, drawing her closer as the last light faded slowly over the trees. "Call me whatever you like," he said finally. "Alaric, when the world is watching, and we must be exactly who they expect us to be. And Kaylan, when it is only the two of us, in this garden, with nothing between us but the truth." Elena smiled, resting her head against his shoulder as the evening settled fully around them, warm and quiet and entirely their own. "Kaylan, then," she said softly, "always, when it is just the two of us." And so it remained, through every season that followed, through council sessions and formal gatherings, and all the careful, watchful eyes of a court that had once seen only weakness in a mistaken name and had slowly, gradually, come to understand it as the beginning of something far stronger than any tradition Thackeray had ever tried to defend. In the quiet of the garden, beneath the stars and the old, night-blooming flowers his mother had planted so many years before, Elena continued to call him by the wrong name, and Alaric Draven, Alpha King of Blackthorn Court, continued to answer to it gladly, every single time, for the rest of both their lives.